Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Claire.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G., and joining me once again today, our director at CTLT, Dr. Claire LaMonica. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Jim.
Hey, welcome to summer.
Yeah, it's beautiful outside.
It is beautiful outside.
Finally.
In fact, I haven't figured out how to record the podcast outside yet, but we will do that one of these days.
We could have birds in the background.
We could have birds, traffic. Actually, they're tearing down one of the apartments next door. So
large machinery.
Yeah, that whole thing. Hey, today we are talking about another of the 7 principles for good practice in undergraduate education.
We are. Principle number 2.
And that is?
Good practice encourages cooperation among students.
So I'm one of those instructors who the first thing I think of is, well, I just assign them some group work.
Yeah.
Done.
I'm done. Yeah, there you go.
I'm guessing it doesn't work quite like that.
No, not really. Well, I mean, I think that's where all of us start.
Yeah.
You know, we all start with this sort of vague notion that having students work together would be a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And so we think of something that we want to happen in our class. We say, yeah, I'll have them work on that in groups.
Mm-hmm.
And then we've got group work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of the first step.
Right.
You know, that's, I think that realization that learning is a social act
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, that's the foundation for this.
Got you.
And so once you're there, then you're really ready to take off and try some new and different things.
So before we get into new and different things, I did want to ask you cooperation. Mm-hmm. What is the difference between cooperation and collaboration?
Yeah, that's a really great question because most of us, including sort of experts in the field, conflate those two terms.
Mm-hmm.
And I was noticing actually in the description in the booklet about the 7 principles,
Mm-hmm.
conflates the two terms.
Right.
It talks about cooperation and collaboration as if they were the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not. I guess the easiest way to explain it is that technically,
Mm-hmm.
cooperative learning has to do with students working together to learn a body of information
Mm-hmm.
or sort of existing knowledge. Okay. And collaboration has to do with students working together to generate something new. So collaboration is a creative act. So they're creating something that hasn't existed before. They may be generating new knowledge, which may be not new for the whole world, but new to them.
Okay.
Sometimes maybe new for the whole world. Certainly if you have students writing a paper together, you know, that text that they create has never existed before,
Mm-hmm.
could never exist under any other circumstances. So
Mm-hmm.
they're actually involved in the process of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of the basic distinction between the two. When we think about cooperative learning, technically we're talking about a very specific kind of structured activity
Okay.
designed to help students learn a specific body of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And incorporating 5 kinds of key elements
Mm-hmm.
that were described originally by some guys named Johnson & Johnson and Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, a long time ago, well, I don't know, back in the 90s, so maybe not all that long ago. But those essential elements are positive interdependence, which means that every person in the group is committed to the success of every other person in the group. They are dependent on each other for that success.
And they realize that.
And they realize
that's
that.
the important part, too.
Yeah, they know that. That's part of the deal. Promotive interaction, which means that they're committed to the idea of actively supporting and helping each other.
Okay.
So it's not a competitive situation at all. They are invested in promoting each other's success. Individual and group accountability. So each individual student is held responsible for mastering the content, the knowledge, whatever it is that they're supposed to be learning. But the group is also held accountable for mastering the knowledge as a group and as a group of individuals. So they're all invested in knowing it as a group and each of them knowing it individually. And then it also has an element of learning how to work in a group. So students are consciously working on the development of teamwork skills. So helping students become better team members is probably a learning outcome for your class. It's something that you are committed to doing. And, that's a good thing.
Sure.
Because that's, being a good team member is one of those soft skills that employers say that they're looking for in college graduates. And we're all like, oh, how do we do that? But this puts the development of that ability in the syllabus, in the learning outcomes. And then we can say, okay, so part of what we're learning in this course is how to be good members of a team. And then that involves the fifth element, which is a certain amount of group processing. So the group, it's kind of metacognition about the group process.
Oh, I see. So being aware of how the group is working as it's working.
Learning how to be good team members by thinking about their team membership and the membership of others, and how the group worked or didn't work based on, not just its ultimate outcome, its deliverable, if you would, but also on whether people really learned and whether they learned to play a particular role in a group or whatever.
Right. Group work is something that we'll be talking about frequently on our podcast. We have talked about it before.
This is kind of my thing.
Well, it is kind of your thing. You really do know your stuff about it, and it's something I think that a lot of instructors still struggle to get past that basic. It's a group assignment. You have to give work on this paper together. That's and so you went through and listed off a lot of things, and we'll link to some resources that help enumerate that again. Right. So for our high altitude view of things today, when you're talking about this idea of, for example, group accountability is something that I've always struggled with when I have done group assignments. And this is, again, working in courses that are very regimented in their structure, gen ed courses where a group assignment is part of the, every instructor gives them a group speech to do. But even then, that whole accountability thing is a bit of a challenge. So how do you get over that without making it a competitive?
Well, that's part of helping the students learn how to make a group work, because a group in a cooperative group,
right,
or even a collaborative group, students aren't in competition with each other. They are all invested in accomplishing the goals that have been set for the group, and so they are accountable as a group for the final product, whatever that is. And each student individually is accountable for contributing to that ultimate product.
I see.
So, and sometimes they're all, so I have worked with people who use this idea of cooperative learning very successfully. And, tests are taken as a group. Students are assigned to work in a group to help each other learn this body of knowledge, whatever we want to call that. And then they take a test together, and they sink or swim based on their ability to do that as a group. There always has to be some individual accountability too, because we're teaching them to work in groups.
Right, and so
that they need to understand that the group isn't going to function well without everybody contributing. So,
and the challenge I've always run into is when I ask students to grade each other. So part of the grade is something that it's either you have someone who's really just had a bad experience, maybe. I don't know exactly what motivates it, and they are really harsh, or they've created this sort of mutually assured destructive pact. And if you give me good grades, I'll give you good grades.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that a little bit before. So I think it probably has to do, like you said, with more about how the assignment is structured.
And how the assessment process is structured.
Right.
So,
Right.
I was actually reading some sort of more recent research on this recently. Well, wow.
Yeah.
Speaking of meta.
Yeah.
And students are more satisfied with their group experience when they are given the chance to evaluate each other based on specific criteria that they're all familiar with.
Okay.
So when I use, and I tend to use collaborative learning more than cooperative learning just because of the nature of my discipline. Okay. So when I start a long-term high stakes group project, so my students are going to spend 3 weeks, 5 weeks longer, however, writing the collaborative production of a text.
Okay.
One of the first things we do before they ever start doing their research or doing their writing, whatever, is I put them to work establishing the criteria by which they will evaluate themselves and each other in terms of their group participation. Their contributions to the group.
Established
They establish the criteria, and and I hold them accountable for evaluating themselves and their peers using those criteria.
Oh, see.
So it might be different criteria in each group, although they don't usually end up turning out to be very different. And they don't know that's what they're doing when they start.
Right.
So I usually start by saying, hey, spend 2 minutes writing about, what it takes to be a really great group member. If you were going to devise the perfect member to work with in your group, what would that look like? And then I say, okay, now let's take another, 60 to 90 seconds to write about the nightmare group member. You don't want this person in your group.
And what they're really doing is they're creating
and what
the
they're
steps
really
in
doing
the, in
is
the,
identifying
in the
their criteria. So then they work together with their group that they're going to work with on this long-term project. And they essentially, now, it may not be a really well-developed rubric, but it's basically, what do we have to do to get an A? What could cause us to get an F? What's good enough? What's satisfactory? What's a C what does a C contributor look like? And then, the B's and the D's, they can kind of, fill that out. But
do that over,
but then at various points in the project, probably midterm and then at the end at least, they use those criteria to evaluate their own work and to evaluate the work of their peers. But they have to write a justification for me based on those criteria.
Okay.
So
I think that's our tip of the day, as it were. I think I really because I'm thinking as I'm listening to you talk about this, I'm thinking I'll be teaching again hopefully this fall. It is going to be more of it's that performance class, so it's more of a collaborative sort of situation. And I did try one of the big high stakes assignments. I did have them. We as a class came up with how are we going to evaluate this.
Sure.
But what I think I want to do is add that portion of as they reflect upon what was the group experience like? Because one of the lessons I try to impart is to have them appreciate how much time it takes to actually do good performance, despite this podcast, how much effort it takes in planning to do this. And
don't let our secrets out of the bag.
I should. Oh, sorry. Did I do that again? Yeah.
We spent weeks.
Right. Anyway, but the idea being, so this is something I can take away.
Yeah.
So.
Well, good. I'm glad.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So maybe a final question. I'm going to ask you to take off your teacher hat. And it's kind of the same hat, but take off your teacher hat, put back on your...
And leave my headphones on, right?
Leave your headphones on, right, yeah. No, and put on your professional development hat, your consultation hat. When people come to you and have issues with any sort of cooperative or collaborative aspect that they're aspiring towards in their teaching, any group work problems or anything like that, what are the most common things you hear? And what's some of the advice that you give them?
Well, I think the most frequent thing I hear is that they're getting pushback from their students. Their students say they don't want to do a group project. They don't like group projects. They don't like being graded on a group project. And I think that's perfectly understandable. By the time students get to us at the university level, they have participated in a lot of group projects, and some of those have been very badly designed.
Sure.
And they have resulted in bad experiences. And, we're not dumb animals. We're pretty smart. We learn to avoid, we avoid the repetition of bad experiences.
Sure.
So, when they come having had a bad experience, that's, I sort of suggest getting that out of the way also early. So I have another activity that I do where I say, where I have them have their students brainstorm a list of bad stuff that happens when you work in a group, and they talk about, I had this guy who never did anything and he got the same grade we did, or sometimes they'll say, well, we had this girl in our group and she wouldn't let anybody do anything because it was all about her and her grades. So she just took over and tried to do the whole thing. They'll come up with a list. Those are probably the two most common things, but they'll come up with a long list. And then I put them to work identifying strategies for dealing with those situations. If this happens in this project,
right,
what will you do as a group? Now, when I did this with ninth graders, they'd say, oh, we'll go to the teacher. I'd say, yeah, thanks a lot, but no. And, so the rule was that they had to have 3 strategies that they could try before they came to the teacher. And then if none of those strategies worked, then they could come to me and I could intervene or whatever. But so I think there's something cathartic even about getting those out on the table. Yeah. And then the idea that you're actually trying to help them identify strategies for overcoming those issues, I think they go into it feeling a lot better.
So this will be the final question,
okay,
and it's a procedural one. What would you recommend? Allow students to choose their own groups, assign groups based on some insight that we have as the instructor, as the teacher, or random.org, And I've done all 3.
Yeah, me too.
What do you find works best?
Well, and the research on that is really mixed. So there's been some research done that said, oh, you should definitely assign groups. And there's other research that says, oh, no, you should definitely let students choose their own groups. I think the key is the kind of group and the purpose of the group. So I've done different things at different times. So when it's just a zero history, quick, we're going to do this in class. Everybody's going to work in a group. Sometimes I let them, and low stakes, zero history, low stakes. I'll say, hey, pick a group. What usually happens is they just turn to the 3 people closest to them,
sure,
and then that's
yeah,
their group. Sometimes when I'm doing something like that, if my goal is to get them to know each other in preparation for a longer stakes group, then I will put the groups together, trying to make sure that everybody works with everybody else before they go into the situation where they're going to pick people. For a long-term, high-stakes project, I use what I call a modified sociometric approach. So I have each student give me the names of, if it's going to be a 5-person group, I say, give me the names of 4 people in the class you'd like to work with. I am not guaranteeing that your group is going to be you and those 4 people, but I will guarantee that you and at least one of those people will be in your same group. And so then I take all of those lists away and I spread them all out all over the dining room table.
Right.
And I, make piles and tear things up and draw lines and things like that.
Wow.
And, and I come up with a set of groups where everybody is in a group with at least one other person that they identified.
Wow.
And so, and it's very interesting. It seems to work pretty well.
Okay.
I also, what I find when I do that is that they tend to end up in fairly homogeneous groups in terms of grades. So I'll end up with A's and B's kind of working together, and B's and C's kind of working together, and I think that's a good thing because Vygotsky. So I then if I put the A's and the F's together or the A's and the D's together, they're going to hate each other, and it's going to be a miserable experience for everybody. because they just don't, they can't relate. But, but if I have the A's and the B's working together, the B's will see the A's as somebody they could be.
In other words, they're closer. They're kind of closer.
It's within their zone of proximal development.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right. Okay. Wow. That was a great answer to what I thought was just a simple little question.
I bet you thought that was going to be really short.
No, not at all. I think it's worth taking the time to experience that sort of stuff. I mean, this reinforces to me how little I know about the thinking behind group work. I think I stumble on success occasionally, but I think it's stumbling. Also, while you were talking about your dining room table and all that, I was having unpleasant memories of when I used to have to schedule a department of 35 people, the weekly work schedule. So hats off to you for doing that.
Well, I don't do it with a class of 125 students. I got to tell you that.
So, and by the way, do you find, in all seriousness, when you do that sociometric sort of look at it, are they able to name 4 other people in the class?
Oh, well, yes, because I don't ever do a high stakes long-term project. That's always within the context of a class that's been designed to build towards that.
Okay.
So we've done a lot of zero history, low stakes group work. And as I said, I'm trying to get them to know as many other people as they can. Also, it's all part of building a learning community. Now I have to say, okay, so here's the caveat.
Yeah.
I don't typically teach classes that are larger than 30, maybe 40 people at the largest. When I teach a writing class, it's going to have 23. When I teach a methods class, it's going to have maybe 25, maybe, So I have not tried this with large lecture groups.
Sure.
With large lecture classes.
Right. So, well, and I'm sure we'll explore that topic in a little bit more detail, too, down the road. In fact, I've been talking to some of our colleagues on campus because you and I both,
people
as we've
who
talked
are
about.
Not me.
Well, you and I both have talked before on this podcast that we are of that size class. Those are usually the classes that we teach. I mean, I had 14 this last semester.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a different experience.
Yeah.
It was great. Don't get me wrong, and not just because it's not a matter of workload. It's that we were able to do some things a little bit more. A little differently. But anyway, my hope is that this summer we'll get some of our colleagues on that teach larger classes and they can share their experience too.
Because we've got some people who do great work in those large classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Claire, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can find out more about our show by going to our website, ctlt.illinoisstate.edu, and click on the podcast link in the corner of the page. For Claire LaMonica and all of my colleagues here at the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology, until we talk again, happy teaching.